As a post-colonial studies scholar, I see immense importance of studying and teaching Charles Dickens, both in my native country, Bangladesh, as well as the US today. As you can see, my title of my PowerPoint presentation or my lecture today is a post-colonial love affair with Charles Dickens. Now, how that love affair came to being, I will tell you the story. But before that, I kind of want to give you a little bit of an idea of what is post-colonialism or what is post-colonial studies. So, doesn't it manually? Oh, it's not working. How do I go to next?
Try the space bar.
Try down at the bottom.
Yeah.
See, there's a little white arrow down there.
Go to oh, yes, I have to keep my... Yeah. All right. I don't know if you can read this, but this is something, if you go to a dictionary or any kind of literary theory dictionary, again, it will give you this definition here. And I'm going to kind of read a little bit, just to give you a sense of what the post-colonialism or post-colonial studies scholars do here. In a literal sense, post-colonial is that which has been preceded by colonization. The second college edition of the American Heritage Dictionary defines it as of, relating to, or being the time following the establishment of independence in colony. In practice, however, the term is used much more loosely. And that's kind of the way I've designed my PowerPoint also. While the denotative definition suggests otherwise, it is not only the period after the departure of the imperial powers that concerns those in the field, but that before independence as well. So when I move into my last part of my presentation, I'll try to show you how that happens, that even though post-colonial studies is supposed to be after colonization, after decolonization, and after the colonies gaining independence, but many of the time it's about the colonial period itself. And I focus on Australia and how, you know, Dickens, even though he didn't contribute to creating sort of a colonial atmosphere there, but people read it during the colonial period, all of the texts that Dickens wrote. And I'll talk about that in my, at the last part of my presentation. So the next thing is, I would like to introduce you to a couple of the scholars of this field. They're highly renowned, and you know, their research started anywhere from 1975 to the recent period. I did not specify the period, but on your right-hand corner is Edward Said. You might have heard about him. I mean, he died recently. He's a Palestinian writer. He came to the US many times, did lectures. So he's a very renowned figure. On your right-hand corner here is Arjun Appadurai, and he's a Caribbean post-colonial studies scholar right at this moment, and I absolutely love him because he's kind of moving from post-colonialism to what is known as hybridity. Now, another word that comes in association with post-colonialism is hybridity, the hybrid nature. And often, you know, even if you look at immigrant communities in the US, South Asian community, you can easily apply that term here, where, you know, our children are married in different racial groups, there's a lot of many immigrants that come together living in one diaspora or several diasporas. On the bottom right-hand corner is Edward Glissois. Again, he is a sort of a French, British, Caribbean, African post-colonial scholar. On your left is the famous French Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, which is one of the biggest book, of course, in this study period. And the middle, again, one of my favorite, Gayatri Spivak. She is the Indian post-colonial scholar. So you can see a kind of a wide range of variety of scholars that work on specific area of the world here. And they have all come to give sort of different analysis of what post-colonial studies mean based on the part of the world that they're coming from, or the cultural background that they themselves have embraced. I am today. Technology is not helping. I might need somebody else's help. I'm sorry about
No,
that.
that's okay.
I'll go ahead and let Kai figure it out. Okay, thank you. Just the space bar?
Yeah, just the space bar.
This one, which one is that? Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Going back to my presentation, I divided the presentation into 3 parts today. In my first part, I would like to talk about my relationship with Dickens, of course, and how I grew up with him. Second part, I would like to look at how Dickens is taught and is revered in South Asia, especially in Bangladesh and India. And of course, one of the other things that how is Dickens is still influencing sort of educational institution in Bangladesh and India, even after so long. I think almost 56 years of the ending of colonial period, 65 years actually. So that would be my second part. And the third one, as I said, I would like to look at the reference to Australia in Charles Dickens's Great Expectation, and we'll give you some sort of an idea about how Dickens was read, how popular he was in 1861 and 1862 in Southern Australia. And that would be the way. Dickens and I go back a long way. As a child growing up in Bangladesh, of course I revered him. Much of my love for British literature comes from my father, who is a history professor. My father completed his master's degree from Glasgow University in Scotland in 1975. And then he did his PhD in 1985 from Melbourne University, Australia. So as you see, my first connection is with my father's visit to London. I've never been to London. I don't know what London looks like, only through pictures. Maybe Augustana would take me there sometime. Study abroad program. Yes, and the second relationship with, again, Dickens and subject and country is, of course, Australia, because I've spent 3 years there. I've had education there. So when my father came back from England, he used to tell us stories of all of these British writers. And one of them was Charles Dickens, and I picked it up because as a history professor, he used to talk about A Tale of Two Cities because he could get to talk about London, he could talk about Paris, he could talk about French Revolution. So he would tell me the stories, and then I would ask my father, okay, who's the writer? Of course, nothing kind of stayed with me. I was very young, and he said Charles Dickens, and I would ask him to tell me more stories about Charles Dickens, and he didn't have enough. He didn't read anymore, and also he spent a lot of time in the university that he taught. His priority was the institution itself and also his students. So we got to see very little of him. So whatever time we got with him, we would ask him to tell us stories, especially of London. And I had the vision that Glasgow was a city covered in glass. And that's why it's called Glasgow. Okay, of course. Reality check, not at all. And those would be the stories that I would love to hear. And going back to A Tale of Two Cities, I didn't understand what he meant by French Revolution. I didn't care at all. But what I wanted to know about was Sidney Cotton, because I felt that he was so brave. I mean, I didn't understand what love meant also, but I thought that he wanted to give life for somebody else. And that was a lesson for me. And I absolutely loved that idea. And from then on, I wanted to read more, but I couldn't read a single line of English when I was in that age. Of course, we are taught English in our country as a second language, but I couldn't read any of the text. So for that moment or period, I had to be happy just by listening to A Tale of Two Cities from my dad again and again and again. I'm going to take a little bit of a break and actually show you what kind of libraries do exist in Bangladesh, because this is what I actually grew up with. I mean, now with my children, I walk down the street and there is the Moline Library, and my children get books. However many they want, and they bring it home. We did not have that kind of thing in Bangladesh when I was growing up. We had these sort of rickshaw pulling temporary libraries that would come to you, and you can pay a dime and they will loan you books. And you can go and read and return it the next week and sort of like that. until the British Council Library. I was introduced to the British Council Library. Now, I couldn't go to the city because, of course, my mother wouldn't let me go by myself over there. So I couldn't access it till I was a high school student. So here is a picture of a library that you can see. And this is particularly a library in a suburb. Like, a suburb in Bangladesh is sort of in between a village and a town. So it would be like near a farmland, a town where there are 450 people living in the US, sort of like that place. So you can see here that even the readers are elderly people who do not have access to newspapers, so maybe the library keeps one, so they will come and read the library. Students maybe need a dictionary, so they cannot buy one. I mean, not always everybody buys a dictionary, so you would come and use it. And on the last side, you can see people looking through the day's newspaper. This is a very recent picture because, as you probably know, with Bangladesh, there's a lot of flooding in many of the places, and many places are low-lying, so there's always water during the monsoon season, June, July, August. To help the students who live in those areas, actually there are libraries inside the boat at the bottom here, and that computer is inside the boat. So it's satellite, also satellite connection, internet connection, and you can check out your email, but it's in a boat, again. So the concept of library, and this is very recent, it's 1990s afterwards. I mean, I happened to come on this picture from a friend's site who does studies with Bangladesh technology and the US, and that's where I came across that. This is what I'm most sort of familiar with. These are libraries in the bus. So there would be a bus that would come, again, sort of like one step ahead of the ones that we had when I was a child. The rickshaw puller is no longer available, it's the bus driver. And inside the bus, it's just a library. As you can see on the right-hand corner, the books are put in the shelf. So these would be library, and they would have lots of collection, both Bangla and English. I mean, there would be a variety of books that are available here. And they would come, and it's cheap. It's like, what, a dime, less than a dime, maybe a couple pennies to get a membership. Because the books are also cheap, the books that I buy are made in, so published in cheap paper. Because, you know, sometimes responsibility, sometimes accountability, that does not happen, so books get lost. So it certainly doesn't affect a lot of their business, so that's why these books are available there. And of course, on the top is the British Council Library in Dhaka. There was a similar one in Rajshahi, but it closed down because of not enough people coming and reading books. I was disheartened by that when I was, I think, in my university year, a second year student when the British Council decided to shut down. But still, the one in Dhaka, it still exists, and you can access almost anything there, both the books that are published in Britain as well as in the US. So here is sort of an idea of how I grew up with the concept of library. I wanted to talk to you about this because I remember Karen talking about this when she was young, and this was a library room, and you know, instantly I thought about what a difference between Karen and Dr. Youngberg and me in terms of understanding what a library concept is. And I thought it would be nice to kind of show you that though both of them are sort of not very different, but not very similar, but in many ways they're different. Coming back to my love of Charles Dickens, so after I grew up, like I went to school and I started learning a little bit more English, and then I would go, my mother would take me shopping with her. There was a age limit when mothers usually take their children to shopping, so I actually came up to that. And I would go with my mom to shop, and we would buy all sorts of things, grocery, clothes, and all of those things. And then we would pass through a book shop. And I just recently learned that same bookshop closed down because the owner died. The bookshop I used to buy my books from. And I was disheartened and thinking, okay, nobody wanted to continue. I mean, wasn't there anybody in the family that would like to continue? I guess it's not a very popular business, it seems. And reminds us of why some of the bookstores here close up. So I went to the bookstore and I saw A Tale of Two Cities. in Bengali. That's the title over there in Bengali. Somebody had translated the book in Bengali, and it was in the bookstore. And it cost 12 taka. 12 taka again, which is less than a dime. But 12 taka for my mother was a lot, because you could buy almost half a kilogram of lentil, or cup of sweets, half a kilogram of sweets, something like that. So I had to beg her, literally beg her. And I think she was afraid that I was creating a scene, so she decided to give me that 12 taka. She was really afraid of her children creating these scenes where, you know, we're asking for money and she's not giving us. Still now, she owns a lot, but yeah, she has still the same kind of vision about us. So I got that book, I read it over 2 nights. Now again, we had restrictions, we couldn't read past 8 p.m. Okay, whoever has that rule. But we had to do that. It was just a rule that we had to follow. But I had a small lamp next to my table. I would bring it to my bed under the mosquito net, because I cannot read it outside. There will be mosquitoes coming and biting me. So, and I read it over 2 nights. Again, at that age, I didn't understand what French Revolution meant. Farashi Biplab was translated, the Bengali is Farashi Biplab. And it came again and again and again. I didn't understand. But what I loved about the book was Sidney Carton. He was my hero. He was in love with somebody else's wife. I mean, by that time, I understood, you know, what love meant, and you know what first time love meant, and all of those things. And it was that romantic side of the story that attracted me to, first of all, to Charles Dickens, and possibly that's why the title came up for me, A Post-Colonial Love Affair, with Charles Dickens. And I fell in love with Sidney Carton, and I read that book till I came to the next Charles Dickens book, again, which was in Bengali, and this time it was Great Expectations. Now, Great Expectation had a different effect on me. Why? Because I was looking at the world through Pepys' eyes. I wanted to be a millionaire. I just wanted somebody to give me some money. And I was thinking, if I had that money, I could be in a fantastic city like England. You know, colonization, British Empire, nothing came to my mind. I didn't even think of those, consider those, were not taught those. But all I thought about was that I want to be rich and go to England, the metropolis city. Perhaps that was the reason why Thomas Macaulay said, and he actually kind of bring in the rule in his Education for India in 1852, that you must teach British literature and language to the Indians if you want to permanently rule India. Okay. Now, as a post-colonial scholar, I feel perhaps that was the reason why Thomas Macaulay thought. You know, nobody really gave thoughts to that point. That could it be an emotional attraction for these readers that could influence the empire to stay for a longer time in those periods. But later on, as a post-colonial studies scholar, when I deconstructed Charles Dickens, I understood that perhaps that was the reason that he tried to get this rule settled in India, pre-independence, independent India. Okay. So again, reading Charles Dickens's Great Expectation, what I did was that I walked in Pepys' shoes. And I looked at the world through Pepys' eyes, and it was absolutely astonishing for me, fascinating for me to understand the Victorian society that Dickens was trying to portray. And then from Great Expectation, I came to Bleak House. Actually, Bleak House I read when I was a graduate student, and Esther Summerson, I fell in love with her too, because she was such a humanitarian character. She was such a role model, and such sort of background of poverty and suffering. I related to her in a different level, you know, more in the realistic realm this time, not so much romanticizing Dickens's world, because I'm sure England is not the way I perceived the metropolis with all its grandeur and loveliness, and there are other sides to it too, which I came to understand through Bleak House. Now, the importance of sort of studying Dickens in Bangladesh and India, what is it about Dickens that, people still study it in South Asian countries. People still study it in Bangladesh and India, even though empire no longer exists. I want to kind of look at that, and I'll show you a couple of things that I have here in the PowerPoint. But before doing that, I would like to quote Thomas Macaulay and his visions for a empire that should come under the British colonization. This is what he said in his minutes on education in 1835. Macaulay proposed that the Indians must be taught British literature and language. And I quote him, "We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect." So basically, what he was saying that you should create gentlemen. The gentleman theory that I was introduced to in Great Expectation, right? If you are a gentleman, well, do you become a snob, or what entails behind being a gentleman? And I think he was also trying to push that idea. In Bengali, the gentlemen were called babus. It was very popular. So these people you would see in native Indian clothes, and they would speak English, they would drink whiskey, and they would listen to British music that came during that time. So those were the class of people actually Macaulay targeted. But of course, there were other greater population that were just the people who were just influenced by the literary aspect of it. And I think the literary aspect of Charles Dickens's text that still lives in those countries, those once colonized countries. Because if you remember, I think she was reminding us that Christmas is coming. Each time Christmas comes, the movie, A Christmas Carol, the books are there in the library, renewed again. The message that A Christmas Carol brings is universal. And I think a lot of the countries in South Asia pick up those messages. And one of the countries is my own native country. So what Bangladesh did this year, because of the 200 years of celebration of Charles Dickens, was that it made a movie out of A Christmas Carol. There it is. That's the movie, that's the advertisement of the movie film in Bangladesh. They've changed the title. And this is what I found fascinating about using Dickens in a post-colonial country to give out a message about the modern problem, economy, poverty, love for money, or who doesn't have that, right? But the Boy Shaki Gun, this film is based on a garments factory owner. Garments factory is something that you might not understand. It's the sweatshop owner. Sweatshop is more popular, right? They're huge in Bangladesh. And people had made so much money by owning a garments factory that you cannot imagine. And how the garments factory work in Bangladesh is that the raw materials come from China, the cotton and all the other materials, and then the finished products come to Bangladesh. And Arizona, if you know the company here, Faded Glory, those are the two companies that have garments factory in Bangladesh. Clothes come from Bangladesh. So anything and everything you wear by Faded Glory, it's made in Bangladesh. And so what the directors did was that sort of switch the story. So this man is a garments factory owner, and Boishak is the first month of the Bengali New Year. So the Bangla New Year. So what people do on that day is spend a lot of money in wearing beautiful clothes like orange, red. They will buy new clothes and a lot of food, like 12, 13 dish on the table. It's just a celebration, just as Christmas or anything. So during that celebration, this man doesn't want to spend a lot of money at all. He's not going to give any bonus to the garments factory owner or anything. Right. So what happens is that inevitable, the ghosts come to visit him. So that's the story, and it's called Boy Shaki Gan. So that's what's happening in Bangladesh right at this moment, because perhaps another aspect that I like about Dickens is some of these messages are universal. And one of them is here, having too much money, or being a miser, or not sharing. And the directors thought that, yes, this is a time when we should show this. Now, the funny thing about it is that since it's a satire, nobody's going to be angry with the director. Okay, perhaps that's one of the reasons why Dickens in his own time didn't mention Australia, didn't mention colonization in Australia or any other parts of the world. He just left it with an indication. Perhaps that could be one of the reasons that he never mentioned those clearly in his books. But as I wanted to tell you, that this is why it's important in reading Dickens, because people are moving it. People are using it in a much more cultural context. Okay. This is something done in India. The Mumbai Chuzzlewits. Again, it's an adaptation of Martin Chuzzlewit's by Charles Dickens. And this is actually a radio show done by Aisha Menon. And if you go and Google search, it's probably still there because it's been aired through BBC. And I listened to it through BBC. And what this does is that it focuses on a Catholic community in India. And again, the story kind of revolves around that Catholic family. Just the same story, except the setting is different. The cultural setting is different here. So this is one of the things, again, that's being done on Charles Dickens. This is sort of a map that I created myself. Very bad at even drawing circles. But I kind of wanted to give you a glimpse of the global literary history that I see of happening here with Charles Dickens. Now, that's the United Kingdom over there in the middle. Here, at the bottom of the right-hand side is Bangladesh and India, where I am. Here is Australia, and then over there in the United States. Okay, here we have United States. Now, why United States? Of course, we know that he came for a visit and he wrote a lot of things about it, but about this country as a whole. But also because recent times, and this is also sort of in the post-colonial studies sort of area that focuses on, is that rewriting of Charles Dickens. Now, you saw the adaptation of Charles Dickens in cultural settings, which I showed you before, but many of the time, many of Charles Dickens' writing has been rewritten. And how, I'm going to tell you about a couple of titles here that I have. The historical novel, A Far Better Rest. This was published in 2000, written by an American author, Susan Alien. And it focuses on, again, the telling of a tale of two cities, that same story here. The historical novel, The Cartoon Chronicles, The Curious Tale of Flashman's True Father. This was actually published in 2010 by Keith Ledler. Again, it's a kind of retelling of the story. Sidney Carton, I wouldn't want to read it because in this book, Carton has a change of mind at the end and he decides not to go into the Beaton. So, no. But I think there are other issues here that you can kind of rewrite to at least get the voice. Again, because of the messages that the book carries itself. The third one is written by an Australian writer, and his name is Peter Carey, and the title is called Jack Maggs. Again, it's rewriting of Great Expectation, where Magwitch, the convict, actually tells us the story, what happens, not through Pip's eye in Great Expectation. It's Magwitch who tells us what's happened, how he came to England and met Pip, and then what happened after that. So I thought that I would sort of give you an idea how he's such a great writer and how he is still influencing not only South Asia but also in the United States when stories are being rewritten. So that completes my first part and my second part of my lecture. I want to go to the third part where I said I'd like to focus on Australia. Because if you know the history of that time, convicts were sent to Australia. And there are plenty of movies based on that. But I learned about this by picking up from Great Expectation and through my study of Magwitch's character. What happened was that you could be sent to one of these colonies just by picking up a bread from a shop. Like a bite of bread, if you pick it up and you are declared as a convict, and then you were sent to these colonies. And that fascinated me from a very earlier time period. Also the other part of it is that in Dickens's writing and many other writings, there were no mention of the Aboriginal people at all. That those people existed just like the Native Americans, and they lived in reservations. None of those were referenced anywhere. So I thought I would look into that history. And again, that's where I invested myself in my relationship with Dickens. I started kind of deconstructing, pulling him apart, pulling his text apart. That doesn't mean that I fell out of love with him, but I learned more things, that why perhaps he couldn't say, or how did he look at Australia? Why was it important for him to send the convict to Australia and bring him back? Why was it so important? And I kind of ponder on that question. And then I realized that, of course, there were a lot of things working behind Dickens's mind. One of them was that who went to the colonies, right? Other than the convict. The English people, and if you do a little bit more background study, which I did with my father, and I have a sort of a major in history too. So what happened was that it's usually people who did not have money in England would go to the colonies to make a name. This is what happened in British India many of the times, in Australia too. So they would go to these colonies, exploit the space of that area, and then would come back with money to England to live a life as if they were lords or barons or noblemen, right? And if you know the structure, the social structure of England, you would know that how barons and lords are looked at, how they're revered, and how they're considered as head of many things. So that's one of the things I think Dickens was criticizing. But again, he couldn't do it. So how did he kind of portray it through Magwitch? Was that Magwitch had a lot of money and he came back, he gave it to Pip, but Pip wasn't successful. Neither was Magwitch, he was caught again. So it didn't really help Magwitch having all those money. Pip couldn't be a gentleman in that sense. I mean, he had a lot of internal conflict within himself, and he resolved those through his melody, but he wasn't the gentleman that Magwitch really wanted him to be, who could walk, you know, wearing rich clothes with a stick in his hand, and who could live a posh life in England. That didn't happen. So indirectly, that's what Dickens's message was, that even if you have the money from the colonizers, first of all, that is not a right thing to do because you are sort of manipulating that space, and second of all, that's a myth. Nobody can be rich with somebody else's money, and that's a reality, and you kind of have to feel that out. The second thing I think Dickens wanted to focus on was that the suffering of the children. And I showed you a textbook in the very early in my PowerPoint presentation here, where the writers of Ashcroft, Bill Ashcroft, and this is his understanding, and he said that Dickens sort of saw a similarity between the suffering children and the people in the colonies, the native people in this case, Aboriginals, not the convicts, not the people who went there to make money, but the Aboriginals. But there is no mention of that again. But he felt that they were the same because the children in England were exploited. If you think about all the other texts, Charles Dickens's texts, where children work in factories and in household places, even Pip, because I think it's a very popular novel and probably all of you have read it. Even Pip, the work he has to do with his brother-in-law and to satisfy his sister also. And he saw the similarity between this native other and the children in England. But then again, you know, he wasn't writing a critical analysis. It was a story that he was saying, and how much could he have said through stories? So those are the two links that I, as a post-colonial studies reader, kind of see. So even if you had money, it was no worth, because the metropolis, the center of British Empire, had its own idea about what is a gentleman, or who is the person who has power. So in terms of power, relationship in power, that was important for me to find out. This is a statistics actually, and as I said, this is called the Southeast Australia, it should be South Australian Institute, which acted as library during that time period, 1861-62. An interesting thing, and I'm fascinated by it, and sometimes I get goosebumps, because the same ship that carried the convicts carried the books to the colonies. At the same time, can you imagine how heart-rendering that is over here? And if you can see a list of book titles and all of these that you could borrow in 1661 and 1662 in South Australia. Adelaide, I would think that's the place. Now, not all parts of Australia had been colonized by the British in that way. Some of them were free states. So Adelaide, I think, was one of them. And look who's at the top of the reading list in Australia in 1861 and 1862. It's Charles Dickens. Same ship, carrying the convicts, carrying the books over here. And then we have Thomas Babington Macaulay. Total loan was 124. So he was also read at that time. Trollope was most famous, of course, because I think they were Anthony Trollope, 492, because the Australian population, this is specific to Adelaide. So the people in Adelaide, they were more focusing on the realistic sort of books. George Eliot was also a popular one because George Eliot made reference to New Zealand. So again, that was a popular author that they were reading at that time period over there. Again, you know, it's hard. I actually got these statistics from a scholar named Tim Dolan, who looked at British mid-Victorian literature in South Australia, how many people read those, and I sort of thought, okay, that's interesting to see, but he couldn't find any stamps. You know, nobody there is no book review. There is no analysis of Great Expectation and reference to Australia. I doubted that people were able to kind of catch up to some of those little bits and pieces of information in the text or not. So that perhaps was the reason why they could not pick up these things. And again, just like me, perhaps they were reading it for the romance of it. Perhaps they were reading because it gave a picture of Victorian England. That's what they're concerned about, learning about another place. Not necessarily relating to the self, which as a post-colonial studies scholar I learned to do very late in my life. I read Heart of Darkness and I thought I was Marlowe, Joseph Conrad, can you imagine? Then later on, when I deconstructed him, I learned, no, I'm not Marlowe, I'm the other over there. But it took time, right? So 1861 and 62 wasn't that period to understand who is the other. All right. It was more about adventure. Okay, so that's the end of my slide. Yeah. All right, so those are some of the things that I actually found out about, not only through my love of Charles Dickens, but also through my studies. As I said that I look at Charles Dickens almost in 3 levels, right, at this moment. My love for his literature, still, Pip is in my life, you see, he's alive. And what I tried to do was I tried to tell my daughter to read it. I read that book to her when she was 3 years old. But somehow she didn't kind of attach it. I don't know. Perhaps because she read Jane Austen. She's 14 and she's already read Jane Austen. So I'm okay. I think she kind of considers herself the Elizabeth of, a brown-skinned Elizabeth of the 21st century. But I had the ambition that she'll be attracted as I was. But anyway, she is attracted to some British author, Jane Austen. I don't know anything about my son yet because all he thinks about is Spider-Man. So we might need to kind of revisit what literary studies means with him. Perhaps bring to Augustana very early and give him some lessons. So today I would like to end this lecture by quoting some of the lines, and you probably all know it because it is very popularly quoted from A Tale of Two Cities. And it's my absolute favorite, although I read it in Bengali, but this is in English. I'm not going to say it in Bengali. And these are a couple of the lines that I would like to say to you, quoted from A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. And the reason I chose this is because if you deconstruct some of the lines in the beginning, it's us, it's me saying, because, going back to the universal nature of Dickens's writing, Dickens's novels, it is the past election and what's been going on through the world, we can easily say that it is the best of times if you think of technology, if you think of where we've reached as human beings, it is the best of time. And then again, if you look at the world politics, we are at the same time at the worst of times, right? But we have, even though we have a little bit of darkness, the much more what we are interested in is the light that we can see at the end of the tunnel. The aspiration, the love for humanity, perhaps that is what will stay with us. And that's why I think, Dickens is an all-time writer. You cannot exclude him from any period. You cannot exclude him from any part of the world, no matter if it's a post-colonial country or it's the metropolis, which is Britain. He is sort of ever alive. And I thought I would leave this lecture by quoting these lines to you. Thank you very much. Yes.
Yes, certainly. When I think about Dickens, I think about him sort of bringing to light the plight of the poor in the factories and industries and so forth. And I think he's often credited with perhaps helping the industrialized world to move beyond the exploitation. And do you see the popularity of Dickens in some of the developing parts of the world as, do you see that as bringing to light? I mean, we still have people who are being taken advantage of, exploited in factories. Do you see, I don't know, do you see any parallels there?
Yeah, definitely. I think, in Bangladesh, for example, I'm going to talk about Bangladesh because that's where I live more. There's still, children are being manipulated. There's still orphan children are picked up and they're sometimes, made into these thieves, just as you've seen in Dickens's world. So, and then the poverty is still there in a country like Bangladesh there. And then the other thing is the loss of property. I didn't get to talk about the women characters. I didn't have time. I knew, but that's another part that I love, and we can do that some other time. Miss Havisham, in Great Expectation, holding on to that old house and all the wealth and all the people kind of coming and wanting money from her, when they thought that she was crazy and she was going to die pretty soon. That's an interesting thing too, because in many parts of the world, still women do not have rights to their property. And I see definitely a parallel between that. Especially in terms of orphan children, no matter if it's Bangladesh or India, and actually Aisha Menon mentions that there's so much of poverty and class difference in South Asia that you can actually kind of switch Dickens's world with our world still now, and because of those problems that are still existing, especially of poverty and the issues of orphan.
Do you find a disconnect between Dickens the man and Dickens the writer?
Do I?
You find a disconnect.
Yeah, dissonance, not matching together. Yeah? Yes, actually. As a scholar, I guess that's one of the things. And I think if you remember, I don't know if you're here with Dr. Karnberg's presentation here, his love affair with the actress, and which he probably denied or didn't talk about a lot, and leaving his children, his family, his wife. That's one of the things that comes to my mind. And then the second one is that the way he portrayed women, nowhere can you find a woman who is soft, who's nice. I mean, they're always hard women, at least from a couple of the readings that I have, and especially, you know, Dickens, Great Expectation is coming to my mind again and again. Miss Havisham, Stella, even Mrs. Joe. And then he doesn't give any names. Many of the women characters are not given any name. Again, Mrs. Joe is Mrs. Joe. She doesn't have a certain name. So, you know, I find those, yes, and I'm thinking, why not? I mean, why didn't you give Mrs. Joe a name? You could call her anything, right? Bring by the hand or any type of thing that you can give in her. Yes, definitely. Again, definitely. And I think that's a paradoxical nature sometimes I feel, that here is my love for this author, and here is all these social realities about him. So should I go ahead and read more of his biography, or I'm just going to leave it? Because, you know, biographies are also, they're differently written. Depends on who's writing the biography. So there are a set of biographies that talk about the things that I have talked about, Dickens the great man, and there are biographies who point out these disconnections, dissonance between the character, the real social character, and the author.
Can you speak to the education of young women in Bangladesh?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I taught there for 3 years. Yeah. Sometimes it is difficult because we're still under, you know, rules where the rules have been set, so it takes a little bit of time to kind of do a little bit of shifting in, I don't want to say bureaucracy, but I'm going to go ahead and say like order of things. Things have been settled, ordered in Bangladesh. Things have been, people have been doing things for a long time in a certain way. It's hard to break that. But the 3 years that I was in Rajshahi University that I taught over there, that was one of my missions, always to encourage women and education. And I try to point out from teaching even the texts that, you know, you need to pick up these issues of how women are portrayed in not only these classics, but also literature in your own country. And you kind of have to understand that position, definitely, yeah. And if I ever get a chance to go back, actually, yes, I would like to do an exchange program with Bangladesh too, and perhaps in Australia. Oh my God. That would be my target. My session would specifically focus on looking up these venues, things that they have already read. For example, Miss Havisham. Pick up Miss Havisham, and why not? Why isn't Miss Havisham the voice of that piece? Why couldn't she be? She wasn't doing anything wrong. I mean, she was hurt. So, you know, in that way, I could easily do a session on that too.